Alrighty. Hi, guys. Thank you so much. So I'm Olivia Madigan. I work for Cafferata Consulting. So I will be running this next session for you guys. There is just a slight schedule change. Unfortunately, David works for USGS, and so he is not able to attend. So I think we're just going to still keep the same structure of we'll just do the first talk, move straight to the third one, and then we'll still hold questions to the end, because then that can allow you guys to use the QR code and whatnot. So with that, without any further ado, I will just go ahead and pass it off to Katie. And her talk is going to be on looking at the super surprised tenants, looking at the old growth obligate forest species in some early seral spots. So Katie, take it away.
Great. Thank everyone for coming. This is going to be a lot of fun. My talk's going to be a little longer than the other ones, but it's going to have more information. No, it's going to have, you'll be ready. It'll be so good. One of the biggest challenges for this talk is I have evolved in my thinking over the past 10 years, and I want to start with a quote. Scientific minds have the curiosity to learn and the courage to unlearn. So I'd like you to just resonate with that a little bit. You all have a curious and scientific mind, and I might change your paradigm a little bit. So one of the challenges is we live in a place where old growth is awe-inspiring and magical for all ages. It is fantastic, and we should dedicate a lot of our places and lives to keep some of the areas that we have and spend the next 200 to 400 years growing more in very strategic areas and places. And I assure you that this feeling of awe and wonder is far better when you're inside the tree, 200 feet in the air. Things are magical beyond belief, and that is one of the privileges that one of my crews and I have to learn from. We use more and more technology to create models to be able to describe for us. And this has been really helpful. But I do want to say that these models are lacking in a lot of the mechanisms, the small scale things that change trees to create things like cavities and things that wildlife species use. I had about 8 years studying spotted owls, and I have kind of a firm impression of what it feels like to be an old growth obligate species. And just wanted to throw out a definition here. And so 10 years ago, I really saw the world black and white. It is so much easier to have a black and white world. And today I'm gonna surprise myself because what I learned is we were basing that black and white world on very little data. We just had an impression of what these species were, and we kept that as the narrative because it was much easier. And I looked back a few days ago to figure out, like, what is the major citation? Where did this come from? And I found this to be hilarious. Carey, 1991, that's for tree voles. That's the old growth paper obligate citation. And it says, old growths provide stability. Trees and young forests are continuously growing and presumably require continual nest relocation. That's not actually true. And so this is the thing that everyone's citing as the fundamental old growth obligate paper, just so we're aware. But this kind of paradigm grows and grows and grows, and it's so inconvenient to diverge from that narrative. And so here's a title for a recent paper in 2019 for the old forest species, and then this 2023 paper, and my friends are these colleagues here, but it basically leaves you with no alternative narrative. Many arboreal old growth obligates, such as the threatened red tree vole. I mean, how many people think that these are an old growth obligate? Somebody raise your hand. Okay, great, that helps. So red tree voles are an endemic small mammal in the vole family, and they live up in Douglas fir canopies. And almost all of our knowledge comes from two very passionate individuals who have trained the entire community. There is no human who does red tree vole research without Eric Forsman. That's just how it has been for the history of time. And these people are so dedicated that we end up in their backyards all the time to do rescue training and hang out as a community. So everyone that works with red tree voles works together at this point. And this is really challenging because red tree vole work is the most physically intensive and emotionally challenging of any wildlife work that anyone's ever seen. You need to carry hundreds of pounds around the woods between the whole crew, and you have to know every piece of equipment your life depends on it very well. And we do that. It creates a whole environment of people that are obsessed and very dedicated. And as an example of what we can do when we surmise data from various sources, Eric was involved because he worked with Chris Mazer, climbed trees, but also he found in spotted owl pellets, about 50% of the diet was red tree voles during a period from before barred owl time. And this is just one thing. Jim and Eric, these two individuals, went to every museum in the United States that had tree vole specimens and figured out that that sample was indeed a red tree vole. There's a lot of agency surveys that have occurred since Survey and Manage in 1994, mainly in Forest Service and BLM and in old growth. And there has been, I would say, a paucity of research, a very small amount, given the amount of time that we've been talking about red tree voles, and only one study that looked at landscape level tree vole effects that was produced by Duncan Hawley in 2009. So over the last century, 100 years, we have created something of a map. And it really is with different eras. Before we had a lot of cool tree climbing equipment, everyone did red tree vole research in young forests. It's the only place you could go. With the Northwest Forest Plan starting in 1994, most people did red tree vole research only in old forests. And now there's a mix. One of the things that we find interesting is my graduate student, Jason Piasecki, was able to look at 62 stands along the Oregon Coast Range, and these results are brand new. What we found is that predicted occupancy was rather high, over 50% in these young forest stands, 20 to 40, but those were also higher likelihood of occupancy near old growth or trees over 80 years of age. And so this is actually a really big number to me, over 60%, with some range of variation. And that's really interesting because this other study by Duncan Hawley in 2009 had a prediction of 25% occurrence in late seral old growth reserves and 17% in non-reserves, but some trees over 90 inches is the max. This is apples and oranges because this study looked at plots and we looked at stands. But the real point here is it's not 100%. Tree voles exist at a low density, probably in all Douglas fir forests where they eat food. And our data suggests that there are more likelihood of old growth, or of red tree voles in the youngest forests, which I can't believe is true, but the data suggests that. So we have to maybe think about that in a different way. One of the biggest challenges is for their nests. Their nests certainly are in higher densities in old growth forests. There is more room for tree voles on branch whorls and cavities and other places. And the scale bar, there's supposed to be an animation, but there's not. In 20 to 40-year-old stands, there is less than 3 nests per hectare on average. And in old growth, that number is more like 40 to 80. So there's a huge difference in nests. But here's the kicker. No one knows how many tree voles are associated with nests. Once we find nests, we could identify them to tree vole. There's a lot of animals that live in the canopy, flying squirrels, wood rats, mice, even some salamanders. Yep. But here's the funny thing. So in 2022, my crew surveyed 62 stands. This is one of the biggest studies in the last 30 years. And about 43% of those stands had tree vole sign. And they surveyed over 5,000 trees and climbed 1,044 with nests in them. And only 15% of the nests had voles or recent sign. And then of that 15%, 20% were occupied. And of those, there was a tree vole. So what that kind of equates to is every 100 nests that you climb takes about a day to climb a tree. So 100 days of effort per person. Not quite. Cody could climb probably 15 trees in a day. Either way, it takes a lot of effort. And this is a very small number of voles. And no one's ever looked in old growth to figure out how many voles are in a tree. It's really hard to do. There have been 2 telemetry studies on the planet for all of the Arboremus species, all of your canopy-dwelling 3 voles. And they have been performed on red tree voles, one by Jimmy Swingle for his masters that you could find 2005, and then one by Mackenzie McCoy, a master's student that I co-advised. Coincidentally, each of these master's theses, they both caught 61 voles. So all of our data in the world is based on 122 voles. That's it. Tall and others were talking about this 3,000 deer data set that they have on one project. I'm never going to get that number. None of us will. We'll never see it in our lifetime, which means we're talking about high levels of uncertainty. Some of the things we found out was that reproduction, the number of females that had little baby voles, is quite high. So of all the nests with females, 80% of those on average have little baby voles. And that's the same number, more or less, throughout all of the forests of Oregon. Whoa, advancing by yourself, not cool? And so these are just some images of voles with fur clips. So to give you an example on movement, voles don't move that far, about 100 meters. So like a vole in its like migrational lifetime might make it to the outside. That's how far they got. This is just one tail of one vole, and we have another female vole that moved 408 meters. Big deal. World record on voles, one female. But what you should try to understand from all of this work is there's a lot of pieces missing to this very complicated puzzle. And some of the things that we have to look towards is, where is the habitat? How many voles are there? This paper by Linnell et al., 2023, has a pretty compelling diagram of habitat changing over time. And a lot of that is due to fire. Right now, the distinct population segment in the North Coast Range of Oregon has been flip-flopping between petitions and warranted, not warranted. And a lot of that is probably from the Tillamook burns in the early 1900s. And now we have the 2020 fires and other big events. We probably won't see voles in the center of those fires in any of our lifetimes or any of our children's, if that is true. So that's something to really think about for this 100-meter moving, awesome small mammal. Another thing that's probably really challenging for voles is weather. One of my friends says, we used to have a climate in Oregon, but now we just have weather. So deep freezes where they are not able to get out of their nests, and ice storms are probably not great. And all of their water comes from needle moisture. So heat domes, probably also not that great. Long drought, probably all not great. So for voles, we're getting a better picture, but there's never been dedicated funding or time in a way that puts us at scale to look at change. Martens, I think we have a better picture of, but it's still blurry. So if you're looking at that, it's supposed to be blurry. And I am thankful to work with a lot of different people who have dedicated a lot of their time to learn about a member of the weasel family. Martens are a cavity-denning obligate. They certainly do that in tree, snags, and log. That's where they're going to have their kits. There we go. They're a member of the weasel family. They're quite playful. They're small, about the size of a gray squirrel. They are dietary generalists, so they can eat whatever they want, assuming they can catch it. But they have to eat about 25% of their body weight a day. So if you've eaten 100 hamburgers today so far, you're doing good on a marten standard. But if you haven't eaten 100 hamburgers, you're going to die. So we really have to get on our biological energetic game. Martens have been acclaimed as an old growth obligate as well. There's a lot of papers and a lot of lawsuits. So martens can be quite contentious throughout North America. I do love this, that old growth structural index, which is something that came from Oregon State as a variable that folks use, is the scientifically accepted gold standard for assessing marten habitat. That's not true. They're not at all correlated. those two variables, which is really hard to deal with because if people are believing to the depth of their soul, Jake talked about like this emotional connection with wildlife. If they believe that so strongly, no amount of data I can produce helps. And this has really been contentious for a subspecies that lives here in Oregon, this coastal or Humboldt marten that is between about, well, that we know about, Yachats down to Northern California near Arcata. In Oregon, you probably already know, a decade ago, we had 26 locations and 14 of those were roadkill. So that's what we had for management, like decision-making. And then now, through the efforts of a lot of people, in a few months, we'll have 7 known groups or populations for this very unique subspecies. And most of what it feels like I've been doing is being behind and trying to help people understand some of the nuances of martens, because observational studies, these things we do, they're probably all right. They're fine for the species that they observed at the time that they observed it, but it's not the whole picture. And that's the big challenge. One of the bigger challenges, I think, is that once upon a time in a land not so far away, all of North America, martens were considered American martens, one species. But by 2019, there's really a large shift where people were accepting that there are 2 species of martens in North America: Pacific marten, what we have west of the Rockies, and American martens east of the Rockies. And this is really interesting because 2 species with the same genus, like wolf and dog, have very different tendencies. Right? Does everyone agree to that? Like these are very different things. But the challenge is everything was written with all of the information mixed. So every sentence switches from American marten to Pacific marten to American marten. And there's no one that can disentangle that except for the most geeky of geeky, who can be like, oh no, Dan Harrison, that's an American marten for sure. And then so you have to like separate all the information out. What we've done is a massive amount of work. So this is both for marten and fisher, another member of the weasel family, but I just wanted to show you the breadth of partnerships and collaborations to try to understand the basic question of where are these animals? So this represents detection dog teams with rogue detection dogs and remote cameras that our crews set out throughout much of forested Oregon by a variety of people. Initially, we had very little data, very few known records of Humboldt martens, as I described, and it was very important to try to understand if they were similar to spotted owls, because that was unknown. So we worked on a paper, don't like the animations, and we found that they're not like spotted owls. So spotted owls, in their predicted habitat, occupy areas predicted to be by spotted owls. They're very aligned, or at least 50% of this habitat predicted. But martens are less than 35%, essentially. So there's not really a strong correlation with where martens live and where reserves are for spotted owls. We also have done modeling to look at where martens could be distributed based on their climate. But I think the innovations that have been most interesting have been done by Tal Levy's lab and his students. This is Maggie Hallerud, who's a PhD student here, who's been working both on DNA metabarcoding, which you've heard from Claire, and also creating these SNPs, or ways to identify martens from their poop. Poop is worth so much when you're trying to learn about their diets and who they are. And we've found some dreadful information. First, we've learned that martens are in places like the dunes. This is an area that the Forest Service planted to create soil stability. There's a good podcast on Outside In, which is NPR New Hampshire, if you want to learn about dune ecology. So we have GPS data or movement tracks of these martens in these 70-year-old forests. We know some of the individuals based on the radio collars. We know their diet. But we also know that these animals are more inbred than Florida panthers and cheetahs. And their population sizes are very, very, very small, like less than maybe 20 in some instances. And that's a horrible number if you're a wildlife conservation person. We've used also a lot of movement data to try to answer really interesting questions about what these animals use in terms of managed forests. And what we're finding is they are using areas available to them. So in the landscape, where there are martens, they are often using most of the patches in correspondence to their availability. So forest and fuel and fire thinning they're using. They might avoid some openings in some conditions, but not all martens. There's variation between individuals. So that's complicated. What I'm excited about is taking the GPS data, fusing it with models to figure out where they're resting and denning. And once we used, I'm not going to bore you with the models we used, but once we used those, we sent out poor veg crews to measure everything at all of the plots in places where there are used marten resting and denning and random locations. And now we're building these machine learning trees with Dr. Holly Monroe and providing managers with fine scale vegetation data that you could look at. So in this case, 16 down logs greater than 16 inches in diameter would provide a higher likelihood of marten occurrence. But there's places that might not have 16 logs per plot. So now we're also looking at different possibilities to provide kind of a suite of options that would be aligning with best available habitat. So in conclusion, we are learning a lot about martens, but there's still a lot of challenges. It looks as if in the past year, martens have the most sensitivity to climate, these Pacific martens. And so that's really curious. We also have these high severity fires. We know that at least 6 martens survived the Dixie Fire, which is really interesting, in the heart of the highest severity of the biggest fire of our history. And we don't know how long they'll survive in those places. So for martens, we have the real challenge of it's not just habitat, but it's a variety of other factors that is restricting their growth. And we need to work together to use huge data sets to provide innovative applied things to get to the point of what martens and tree voles need. And I'd like to equate this to like your dream house, right? Like we talk about old growth as a thing, but your dream house is not great if it doesn't have a sink and a bathtub and a bed and heat and insulation. We picture old growth as a state that may be unrelenting, but we need to make sure all of the fine scale things that make that a home are present. What are the things we need to make that home for all of these hard species? And when we don't do that, we're losing opportunities in places where we don't expect them. And I'm going to stop there. Actually, I'm going to stop here and thank everybody I know.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was very, very fascinating, and I love your slides. So again, we're just going to go ahead and go straight to our third panelist or speaker. This is going to be Jennifer, and her presentation is going to be on restoring Murrelet habitat, looking at the new insights on the role of fire with habitat development. And then again, please feel free to use that QR code to ask any questions, and then we'll go ahead and go from there and maybe have a little longer lunch. Woo!
Morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I was just telling Katie walking up here, I couldn't have asked for a better intro presentation coming up to this, because when we're talking about paradigm shifts and surprises and things that we expect to find and don't find, this study is really a perfect example of that. So I'm a PhD student here at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. I'm also the targeted research coordinator. So I wear multiple hats, depends on the day. Today you get the PhD student. So what I am looking at for my research is the marble murrelet and its relationship with fire. It's more than that, it's disturbance, but today we're just going to focus on the fire part because they didn't give me 40 minutes, they gave me 20. So we're going to talk about just the fire part today, but it's all related and has been really fascinating. So to start off you all probably know about the murrelet, but we're going to give just a brief introduction as well. This is a threatened and endangered seabird species that can be found along the west coast of North America, and it can be found all the way from Southern California, central Southern California, all the way up through British Columbia and Alaska. And everywhere except for Alaska, this species is listed as a threatened and endangered species. This also includes Canada as well. So this species forages off the nearshore waters, and unlike other seabird species in their same family, they actually will travel up to 50 miles inland to nest in older forests. They do not build a nest like other forest species, but instead they lay a single egg on a wide branch. This branch has to be at least 10 centimeters of diameter or more, otherwise that egg's rolling right off and the chick along with it. And so they really need a lot of structure, which is why we often think about them in these older forests, because those older forests have the branch structure and diameter to support that nest. Here in Oregon, where our study takes place, most of the forests that they are nesting in are either right along the coast in the fog belt, or Sitka spruce, western hemlock, or they're a little bit further inland in our Douglas fir dominated forests. So a lot of the literature and a lot of the concerns, I mentioned that they are a threatened and endangered species. So a lot of what we talk about is this loss of habitat due to our harvest practices and intensive forestry practices. So these high severity disturbances, removing habitat from the landscape, and that being one of the big threats. But for the purposes of this talk, and also more generally, I want us to take a moment to think about disturbance also as an ecological process. And there are many different kinds of disturbance across the landscape. Some of them are this forested or this forest harvest, and some of them are different. Okay, so down in California in 2020, the CZU fire, which happened, the CZU complex fire, which happened, actually removed an incredible amount of marble murrelet habitat. And this is becoming a really big concern, thinking about the impacts of fire on habitat and the removal of habitat. Now you may be thinking, okay, but that's the Californians, and we're up here in Oregon. We have these nice wet rainforests. We don't have fire, right? Except we know that we have, right? So this is a depiction from a homestead that's right within our forest or our study area that was done in 1880. And you can even see in the background still the remnants of the 1849 fire, which was a big high severity fire that impacted a large footprint of the Coast Range, and clearly led to quite a bit of loss of timber and habitat at that time. Okay, so this is in 1849. I want you to take that date and hold on to it for a minute in your head, because we're going to come back to it, okay? But these fires are thought to be high intensity and long intervals between, or long fire return intervals. A lot of estimates are anywhere between, we get one of these fires once every 200 or 400 years. In the fog belt of Oregon, sometimes those estimates might be all the way up to 1,000 years between fires. Okay, so these are pretty long fires, or long interval fires, or at least that's what we think. So we have these high severity, no matter what the source, we have these high severity disturbance events that actually remove a lot of habitat. How do we get from these high severity disturbances to what is now this structurally complex forested stand that can support marble murrelets, that has these big wide branches that they can lay their egg and not worry about someone falling off the side? How do we get from point A to point B? And is there just one path, or are there potentially multiple paths? So we have a very classic model for how the Coast Range develops. And it starts with these high severity disturbances. Then you go into the pre-forest stage where you've got initiation. You get you start to go into canopy closure, where you're getting competition and stem exclusion. So certain trees are shaded out and others are the winners and are continuing to go up. You move into older forest, where you start to get agent-based mortality and understory reinitiation, and you end up in this old forest with vertical and horizontal complexity. Or at least this is the model, and this is a model we have. And as you can see along the bottom, if you were paying attention to this moving along, this older forest really, at least according to this model, doesn't even start to happen until around 200 years of age. So perhaps it's not too much of a surprise that a lot of people assume that marble murrelet nests are at least or at least their nest trees are at least 200 years of age or older, right? Because that's really the age, according to this model, that we start to get a lot of that complexity and that structural complexity. But there's a bit of a problem with this model. There's a few things missing. One of the first ones I want to mention is that the model does not account for people in the landscape. And we know that people have been on this landscape. People have been in the Coast Range since time immemorial. And our Indigenous partners have talked about this a lot, but there have been people shaping the Coast Range for a long time, and they're not included in that model. The second thing is just looking, when you go out into a marble murrelet stands, just being in those stands. This is a nest on a primary branch in a tree. This tree grew in relatively open conditions. With Douglas fir, if you get the shading and the competition, the tree is actually amazing, and it will shed its lower branches and put priorities onto the top part of the canopy. So you won't get the development that you need for these wide branches. It'll just shed them early on. This tree itself was developing in fairly open conditions as it was developing. Okay, so these questions started to arise, and we started to think, is this classic model really a good way to look at how habitat develops for marble murrelets? Is this the way that we need to look at it when we're looking at restoring following these high severity high severity disturbance events and looking into building habitat into the future? So we went out to test it. We are looking at 48 sites. These are within the Central Oregon Coast Range. And I was smiling as Katie was talking, because she was talking about never having a whole lot of data to work with. In all of the state of Oregon, we have about 100 known nest sites, period. When I was studying white-crowned sparrow, like 100 nests was like a good week for me. In all of Oregon, since the 1990s, we only have 100 known nest sites. We're using about half of those, and all of the ones are concentrated here in the Central Oregon Coast Range. For today's talk and the results that I'm going to be showing you, these are mostly from the north part. We do kind of around the Siuslaw National Forest. We do have a clump that we are going to be looking at for the Elliott, but you're going to have to come back next year or talk to me later for those because we haven't sampled those yet. So at each of our sites, we are setting up what is essentially a mimic or mimic forest inventory analysis plot. So those of you that are familiar with the FIA program, we're setting up a plot that's similar to what the Forest Service is doing there. It's 4 concentric circles, all touching. And then in our case, we're putting the nest, the marble murrelet tree nest, right at the center of those circles. So we're sampling the stand around the nest tree itself. Within each of those circles, we're doing live tree coring. This gives us the ages of the trees during establishment. We also get to look at when they had spurts of growth and when they were restricted. We're doing sampling of legacy stumps, so taking cross sections. Some of those are from within the site. A lot of them are in the very close surrounding areas. We don't always get as many stumps as we want right within the stand or within the plots themselves. We're sampling all the vegetation, live vegetation, dead vegetation, and then we're putting it all together to create a really nice picture of what is not only on the stand currently, but what's been there historically and how it's changed through time. We take all these samples back to the lab, and for anyone that hasn't worked in tree ring science, oh, you're missing out. It's so much fun. It's like a history project and a science project all combined into one. But basically what you can do is we do our own form of barcoding. Sorry, geneticists, it's different. But we do our own barcoding, and the climate has very specific signals that it sets in the tree rings, and we're able to build these chronologies. So we can take a live tree where we can count back the dates, and we match up the climate signals with older tree samples. We can actually work back in time. On the right-hand side, you're seeing this is these are fire scars that we've actually been able to date to exact years when that fire occurred, when the damage to the tree actually occurred. So we're able to get a lot of great information, not only about what has happened throughout the tree's life, but also what disturbance events have impacted it. So I'm going to get into a little bit of the results here. And before I get started, I want to emphasize that this is an ongoing study. So these are preliminary results. And I asked you to, if you have cameras or things, just put them away for now and just enjoy the conversation and the ride with me, because we're still building this data set. We will get it out into publication at some point. But for now, let's just walk through the data together, okay? So we're going to start with tree ring data first. And this tells us these are the tree rings that and the cores that we've taken from the live trees. So these are the three, I put on 3 species that we have actual nest trees in. There are a lot more trees than that we have sampled of different species, red alder, cascara, all these trees. If I put it all on, it would be quite a gumball machine there. But what we find from this information here, I'm going to give you just a guide here. On the bottom, on the x-axis, this is the tree age in years, and on the y-axis, we have the diameter at breast height. So a bit of a measure of the size of the tree. Okay, so one thing we immediately pull out, in case you didn't miss the bright red line that I popped right in here, there are not a lot of trees that are older than about 170, 180 years. Okay, these are from all of our marble Murrelet stands in the north part, which covers about 600,000 acres. Okay, we are just sampling at marble Murrelet stands, so it's not a random sample at this time, but within our marble Murrelet stands, there are not a lot of trees that are older than 149 or 180, sorry, excuse me, 170 to 180 years old. Okay. The other thing you're going to notice is if you know a lot about forest dynamics and forest development, for Douglas fir, it actually needs fire a lot of times in order to get established in the Coast Range. So what we would normally expect to see is we get a high severity fire like the 1849 fire here. And then we'd expect to see a pulse of regeneration from the Douglas fir, which we do. But what we normally expect to see is that it starts to gradually go into more shade tolerant species, and that's the successional pathway we would expect to take. Instead, we're seeing this real smear of trees coming in at different times, which starts to lead us to think, okay, we have one fire that's clearly shaping the Coast Range and these nest sites, but is there more to it than that? Now, you might be wondering, we're talking about Murrelet nests. So where do the Murrelet nests fit in? We have some trees that obviously survived the 1849 fire or perhaps weren't impacted by it. So maybe those are all of our nest trees, right? Well, some of them are. Some of them are these older trees. But 80% of the marble Murrelet trees actually established after the 1849 fire. They range in age from 118 years to 461 years. The majority of them being less than 200 years. All right, so thinking back to that classic model, we're expecting trees to not even start to become nest trees until 200 years or old, 200 years old or older. What's going on here? There's something more to this story. And that leads us to the development history, or to the disturbance history, excuse me. And this is where our cross sections come. We have these cross sections that we're able to look at the fire events, at the wind events, and we're able to start to piece together the different events that have impacted this, each of these stands. So for this, we're going to restrict down to just 5 sites that we've fully processed through these cross sections. Okay, and so these are circled here on the right-hand side. Okay, these 5 sites. Remember at the beginning when I told you that we have a fire once every 200 to 400 years, or maybe even 1,000 years? Turns out that's not really the case. In the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, we have, oh, excuse me, too far. Oh no. We have 6 fires within each century. In the 1800s, that jumped up to 9 fires. And I say fires, but I actually mean fire years. These are years where we had fires in them, okay? So we actually had 9 fires within this footprint of the Coast Range in the 1800s. 1900s, it drops down to 3, and those are actually appear to be associated with harvests that were actually done in the surrounding area, so they're probably more like slash burns. And then since 2000, nothing, at least nothing at any of our sites so far. Okay, this is a lot of fire, a lot more than we were anticipating. Now, you might be wondering, okay, are they all as big as the 1849 fire? Is the footprint as big? The answer is no. Most of these fires are single site fires. They're very localized fires just at individual sites. So here we've broken it up, we've added colors, and we've broken it up by site. And so this site here that happened in the by 1538 only happened at this one site. Now the 1849 fire, that happened at 4 of our 5 sites here. So we start to get an idea for the spatial complexity of this firescape and the spatial diversity of the firescape. Now, if you're looking at this graph, you're also noticing something else, and that is the temporal diversity of these fires. So the temporal diversity of these fires are not synchronous. If these fires were just climate driven and just east wind event driven, we would expect to see that all sites are burning at the same time. Instead, we're seeing these peaks of fires in different centuries at different sites. They're asynchronous. They're decoupled from a lot of the climate drivers that we would normally expect to see. We have a couple of, we're just getting into this data now. We have a couple of hypotheses as to why this might be happening. One is the reburn hypotheses. And in other words, when a fire goes through the site, it changes the ecosystem enough that makes it hotter, drier, more open, and actually makes it more susceptible to reburns. That's one possibility. The other is that we're actually potentially seeing a signature of people moving across the landscape through time, or it might be a combination of the two together. So this is really new data. We obviously have 48 sites. We've done 5. We're just over 10% of the way, or yeah, we got a long ways to go. So we've got a lot more information to add in here, but it's really cool information that we're finding so far. So how do we put it all together? We have the ages of the trees, we have the disturbance states. How do we mix these two things together and start to get an information about how we restore marble murrelet habitat? And I want to qualify this in that the future is going to look different than the past. So we're going to have to include climate data. We're going to have to include current and existing conditions. But let's start by looking at how these stands that we have now did develop in the past and use that as a starting place to build on. So we're going to look at one site, which is the Beamer Creek site. This is a bit of a complex plot, so I'm going to walk you through it. On the right-hand side, we have the year up here. This is the year that the tree established. The tree is right here in the center. And you're looking down at this plot as if you were looking from a bird's eye view, just like it was sampled when I showed the sampling in the beginning. So the marble murrelet nest tree in this case was a western hemlock. At that time of establishment, there were 2 other trees in that site. They were alive at the time. They are currently dead. So what you're seeing here, that's their status as of today, whether alive or dead, their size and their species, although their species hasn't changed through time. We haven't found that species changes through time. But we're going to go ahead and push play on this here and walk you through how the stand established after the murrelet tree started. One thing I want you to notice is by the time the murrelet tree initiated, there had already been 3 sites or 3 fires within that site already. Why do we care about that? Well, if you know, looking at this site, this was a pretty open site when the murrelet tree came in. We don't have much evidence that there was a whole lot of biomass at that site before the establishment of the tree. This started in pretty open conditions. So on the right-hand side, years are ticking by. We're also adding fires that are happening. And the stand is starting to fill in. The 1849 fire did impact the site, but didn't kill the western hemlock, and those guys do not like fire. Okay, and that gets us up to 1977, which was the most recent date of an establishment of a tree on this site. There was a fire in 1948, but this appears to be a slash burn. These 2 stumps here were actually harvested in the 1940s, and so it appears to be a slash burn following that harvest. So using this information, all of it together, we can start to build these models for how the stands developed through time, what their density was, what different things impacted them through time. So some key takeaways, okay? We've got nest trees that are younger than 200 years, and that really emphasizes the role of disturbance in accelerating the development of these habitats. We've got both high and maybe more moderate or lower severity, at least non-stand replacing fires that are impacting these sites. The high severity sites really act as wiping the canvas blank, but these lower and moderate severity fires, these localized fires, are acting as editors along the way, editing the stand and changing the dynamics, causing pulses of regeneration and also clearing out some of the younger trees. And the firescape here is complex in its place-based. It's temporally and geographically asynchronous. And so it's very much oriented on where you are within the coast range at any given time. So our next steps going forward is we got to finish sampling. So we've got a lot more work ahead of us, but we're also analyzing these places within their biophysical setting and context as well. So within the coast, within the fog belt, which is the stand that you just looked at, that was within the fog belt. It was only 3 miles from the coast. What does that look like compared to some place that's 20 miles inland or a little further inland, or that north to south orientation as well? We're incorporating other roles and other types of disturbance. So abiotic and biotic disturbances. Wind, we know wind has a huge impact in the coast range, but there's also laminated root rot and bark beetle and all kinds of things coming in and playing a role at shaping these really, really, really complex older forest stands. And then we have a complementary study going on with some of our tribal partners, and we're starting to work with them and at their direction to piece together some of the oral history of the Coast Range and how it's developed through time. And so lots of great stuff going on, lots of ongoing stuff going on, many balls in the air, but some really cool information coming up that will hopefully help us to look forward. And with that, I want to thank our partners and our funders and all of you for being here today.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Jennifer. We do have one quick question for you. So the question is, what percentage of murrelets use coastal cliffs versus forest nesting sites? And how does this distribution in Oregon compare to further north in their range?
So in the state of Oregon, we have not found any cliff nests thus far. That doesn't mean they're not out there, but we have not found any cliff nests. For those of you familiar with the species, we do have cliff nests found up in Alaska and a few in British Columbia as well. But the cliff nests, for whatever reason, don't appear to be one of the strategies of murrelets down here in Oregon, at least so far that we've found. So that's not something up in the further north part, they will use cliff edges. They will also use, they will nest inland, but at the bases of trees as well. So there's a little more diversity in what they're using further north, and the cause of that is still up for discussion.
Alrighty, and final question is, fires have patchy effects and tree structure is important for nests. So are these trees generally open grown if younger than 200 years old?
Yeah, good question. Our thought is yes, they're fairly open grown trees, at least in the initial stages, but we're piecing that information together. What we're doing is looking at the growth of the rings at different points in time and using models to look back at what the potential density of the stands were at different periods of their development. So we're putting that together. I don't have an answer for you specifically yet as far as how dense or open these stands were, but yes, we've got some evidence that some of these stands were fairly open during the initial establishment.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.